How America Turned the Tide. Saratoga, 1777. The year 1777 was supposed to be Britain's moment of triumph. After suffering the embarrassing defeats at Trenton and Princeton, the British Empire was determined to crush the American rebellion once and for all. But what they didn't realize was that their own strategic blunders would hand the Americans the most decisive victory of the entire war. Welcome to Military Hmmm, where we dive deep into the pivotal moments that shaped military history. Today we're exploring how a series of miscommunications, overconfident generals, and one brilliant Polish engineer turned what should have been Britain's crushing victory into America's greatest triumph at Saratoga. By late 1776, things looked grim for the American cause. George Washington's Continental Army had been battered and bruised, driven from New York City in a series of humiliating defeats. The British controlled America's largest city and most important port. European observers were already writing obituaries for the American experiment in independence. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming in the British war machine that would soon split wide open. Back in London, the government was growing increasingly anxious. For years, they had clung to the belief that American colonists were fundamentally loyal subjects who were simply being misled by a small group of radical agitators. This misconception would prove fatal to their entire strategy. Meanwhile, opposition voices in Parliament were growing bolder. The costs of the war were mounting, and even some members of the ruling party were beginning to question whether crushing the rebellion was worth the enormous expense. But it wasn't just domestic pressure that worried British leadership. Across Europe, traditional enemies were watching Britain's struggles with barely concealed glee. France, still smarting from their humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War, was particularly interested in any opportunity to strike back at their longtime rival. French Foreign Minister Vergennes had already begun secretly funneling supplies to the Americans through Caribbean intermediaries, testing the waters for a more formal alliance. The diplomatic situation was becoming increasingly precarious for Britain. They found themselves virtually isolated in Europe, with most continental powers either actively supporting the American cause or at least hoping for British defeat. Young European officers, inspired by Enlightenment ideals of liberty, were making their way across the Atlantic to join Washington's army. Among them was a Polish military engineer named Tadeusz Kościuszko, whose expertise in fortification would prove crucial in the coming campaign. Recognizing that 1777 had to be the decisive year, British Commander-in-Chief William Howe began developing an ambitious strategy to end the rebellion permanently. His original plan was elegantly simple in concept, but complex in execution. Multiple British armies would converge on the rebellious colonies from different directions, crushing American resistance through coordinated pressure. The strategy called for 10,000 fresh troops to land at Newport, Rhode Island, securing the New England coastline. Another 10,000 would march up the Hudson River from New York to Albany. Simultaneously, a similar-sized force would push south from Canada down Lake Champlain, also heading for Albany. Howe himself would lead 8,000 men against Philadelphia, the rebel capital, while leaving 5,000 to hold New York City. The logic behind this plan seemed sound. New England was widely considered the heart of the rebellion. If they could isolate and subdue this region while simultaneously capturing the rebel capital, surely the remaining colonies would see the futility of continued resistance and surrender. However, by January 1777, it became clear that London wouldn't provide the necessary reinforcements to execute this ambitious, multi-pronged strategy. Even worse, Howe was beginning to doubt whether isolating New England would actually end the rebellion. The intense guerrilla warfare he was witnessing in New Jersey and the countryside around New York demonstrated just how committed ordinary Americans were to the cause of independence. This realization led Howe to fundamentally revise his strategy. Instead of trying to isolate New England, he would focus on utterly destroying Washington's Continental Army in open battle, then march triumphantly into Philadelphia. Any European nation would surely capitulate under such circumstances, and Howe expected Americans would prove no different. Meanwhile, in London, another ambitious general was hatching his own plans for glory. Major General John Burgoyne, known for his theatrical flair and supreme confidence, was jealous of the attention his colleagues were receiving. He wanted his own independent command and saw an opportunity in the Northern Theater. Burgoyne's plan called for him to lead a substantial army of 8,500 men south from Canada down Lake Champlain. They would capture the strategic fortress at Ticonderoga, then continue down the Hudson River Valley toward Albany. A smaller force of 2,000 would simultaneously move east from Lake Ontario down the Mohawk River Valley. The plan assumed that Howe would move north up the Hudson, and all three forces would converge at Albany, effectively cutting New England off from the rest of the rebellious colonies. The plan looked brilliant on paper, and Colonial Secretary George Germain approved it on February 28th. But here's where the first critical error occurred. Germain had already received and approved Howe's revised Philadelphia strategy 5 days earlier. Either through negligence or miscommunication, Germain failed to inform either general about the other's plans. This oversight would prove catastrophic. Howe never seriously considered moving up the Hudson to support Burgoyne, and Germain never corrected this misunderstanding. Two major British armies would soon be operating in complete isolation from each other, with no coordination whatsoever. While British generals were making plans in comfortable London drawing rooms, American forces were adapting to the harsh realities of fighting a guerrilla war against the world's most powerful military. Washington had learned painful lessons from his defeats around New York. His Continental soldiers, brave as they were, simply couldn't stand toe-to-toe with British regulars in conventional European-style battles. Instead, Washington began developing what military historians call a Fabian strategy, named after the Roman general who wore down Hannibal through harassment rather than direct confrontation. The goal was to keep the Continental Army intact while avoiding decisive battles, striking at British supply lines and isolated detachments whenever possible. This strategy required incredible discipline and patience. It meant accepting that the British might capture important cities like New York and Philadelphia while maintaining faith that time and persistence would eventually wear down British resolve. It was a strategy that demanded sacrifices from both soldiers and civilians, as American forces would have to retreat repeatedly, often abandoning their own communities to British occupation. The stage was now set for one of the most consequential campaigns in American military history. Two British armies would soon be marching into the American wilderness, each believing the other would provide crucial support that would never come. Meanwhile, American forces were preparing to fight for their very survival, armed with little more than determination and the growing conviction that their cause was just. What happened next would shock the world and change the course of history forever. The overconfident British generals who expected easy victory would instead stumble into a series of disasters that would hand America its most important triumph and bring France openly into the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal military campaigns, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Military for more fascinating stories from military history. Drop a comment below and let us know what other battles and campaigns you'd like us to explore. In our next episode, we'll follow Burgoyne's army as it marches confidently into the American wilderness, completely unaware of the trap that's being prepared for them. The Philadelphia campaign began with Howe's characteristic confidence, but almost immediately ran into complications that should have served as warnings of what lay ahead. From April through June 1777, Howe desperately tried to lure Washington out of his defensive positions near Morristown and Middlebrook. Every attempt failed. Washington had learned his lesson from New York and refused to be drawn into the kind of pitched battle that had cost him so dearly. Howe's frustration grew with each failed maneuver. In June, he attempted an elaborate feint, pretending to retreat and then springing an ambush on any pursuing American forces. But Washington's scouts detected the trap, and the Continental vanguard pulled back before walking into disaster. The American general was proving far more cautious and cunning than Howe had anticipated. Making matters worse for the British, Tadeusz Kościuszko had been busy. The Polish engineer had surveyed the Delaware River approaches to Philadelphia and constructed a series of formidable fortifications that would make any direct overland assault extremely costly. Faced with these obstacles, Howe made a fateful decision that would waste precious weeks and resources. Instead of the direct overland approach, Howe decided to transport his entire army by sea. It seemed like a clever solution that would bypass American defenses, but it came with its own set of problems. Loading 17,000 soldiers, along with their equipment, supplies, and horses onto ships, was a massive logistical undertaking that consumed valuable time. The plan called for sailing the army as close to Philadelphia as possible, then disembarking for a quick march to the rebel capital. If Washington tried to defend the city, his army would be crushed by superior British forces. If he didn't, Howe would capture Philadelphia and then move out to find and destroy the Continental Army as it attempted to retake the city. Henry Clinton, left behind to hold New York with just 7,000 men, was appalled by this strategy. He correctly pointed out that his force was barely adequate to defend the city, let alone provide meaningful support to either Howe or the northern campaign that Burgoyne was preparing. The distances involved meant that by the time Clinton learned of trouble elsewhere, any relief force would arrive far too late to make a difference. But Howe brushed aside Clinton's objections and set sail on July 25th. What followed was a voyage that perfectly encapsulated the confusion and poor decision-making that characterized British strategy in 1777. Washington immediately learned of Howe's departure from New York, but had no idea where the British fleet was headed. Suspecting another elaborate feint, he kept his forces positioned to defend against a possible return to New York. It wasn't until British ships were spotted entering Chesapeake Bay that Washington realized Philadelphia was indeed Howe's target and began racing south to intercept him. The choice to sail up the Chesapeake rather than the Delaware River added another week to Howe's voyage, during which storms battered his fleet and cost him both soldiers and precious supplies. Why he made this decision remains unclear to historians, but it gave Washington crucial additional time to prepare his defenses. When Howe finally landed at Head of Elk in Maryland on August 25th, he faced yet another delay. His army was scattered and weakened from the difficult sea voyage, and he spent another full week foraging for supplies, while Washington's 15,000 men prepared defensive positions along Brandywine Creek. The Battle of Brandywine on September 11th showcased both British tactical skill and the growing competence of American forces. Howe employed the same flanking maneuver that had worked so brilliantly at Long Island, sending Cornwallis with 9,000 men on a wide march around Washington's right flank, while Knyphausen distracted the Americans with a frontal assault. Initially, the plan worked perfectly. American scouts discovered the flanking movement in time to warn Washington, but the Continental Army was still repositioning when Cornwallis attacked at 4 in the afternoon. The leftmost American division crumbled immediately under assault from the elite British Guards, and panic began to spread through the ranks. Disaster seemed imminent until Washington demonstrated the leadership qualities that made him indispensable to the American cause. He personally directed Nathaniel Greene to move his division to the village of Dilworth, where they formed a disciplined rearguard that allowed the rest of the army to escape in good order. By 8 o'clock, darkness had ended the British pursuit, and the Continental Army had lived to fight another day. Howe had won a tactical victory, but strategically, he had accomplished nothing. The American army remained intact, and his own forces were no closer to ending the rebellion. After another pause for foraging, Howe resumed his pursuit, but Washington skillfully avoided another major engagement while falling back toward Philadelphia. On September 26th, Howe marched triumphantly into the rebel capital, expecting to find a demoralized population ready to welcome British rule. Instead, he found a nearly empty city. The Continental Congress had evacuated to York and made it clear they intended to continue the fight. Most of the city's supplies had been removed or destroyed before the British arrival. This should have been a moment of celebration for Howe, but instead, it highlighted the fundamental flaw in British strategy. Capturing cities meant nothing if the rebellion's leadership remained defiant and its army remained in the field. European warfare, where the capture of a capital typically ended conflicts, simply didn't apply to this new kind of revolutionary struggle. Realizing he still had to find and destroy Washington's army, Howe left 3,000 men to garrison Philadelphia and moved the rest of his forces to Germantown. This division of his army gave Washington exactly the kind of opportunity he had been waiting for. The Battle of Germantown on October 4th demonstrated how much the Continental Army had learned since those dark days in New York. Washington planned another surprise dawn attack, similar to his triumph at Trenton, with multiple columns converging on the British position simultaneously. The attack began brilliantly. John Sullivan's column struck first, catching the British completely off guard and driving them back through the streets of Germantown. For a moment, it looked like Washington might achieve another stunning victory that could change the entire course of the war, but the fog that had concealed the American approach now worked against them. Thick mist, made worse by gun smoke, caused the attacking columns to lose coordination and direction. When some Continental soldiers took shelter in the stone chew house and continued firing, their own comrades mistook them for British troops and began shooting at each other in the confusion. The moment of opportunity slipped away as British forces recovered from their initial shock and began organizing a counterattack. Washington, seeing his advantage evaporating in the fog, ordered a withdrawal. His army had come tantalizingly close to a victory that might have ended the war, but once again, they had to settle for having simply survived another encounter with professional European soldiers. As winter approached, both armies settled into defensive positions. Howe had achieved his limited objective of capturing Philadelphia, but the rebellion continued unabated. Congress was still meeting, the Continental Army remained dangerous, and British control extended little beyond the cities they directly occupied. Far more ominously for British prospects, catastrophic events were unfolding in the Northern Theater, where Burgoyne's campaign was heading toward complete disaster. The lack of coordination between the two British armies was about to exact a terrible price. The stage was set for the battles that would truly turn the tide of the American Revolution. If you're fascinated by these pivotal moments in military history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Military Hmmm for more in-depth explorations of the campaigns and battles that shaped our world. What other military turning points would you like us to examine? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next episode where we witness Burgoyne's army march into one of the most decisive traps in military history. The Battle of Saratoga stands as one of history's most perfect examples of how strategic blunders can transform certain victory into crushing defeat. What began as Britain's master plan to end the American rebellion became the very catalyst that turned a colonial uprising into a global war against the British Empire. Burgoyne's surrender on October 17th sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe and the halls of power in London. In one devastating moment, Britain lost an entire army, and with it any hope of maintaining its monopoly on American affairs. The news reached Paris like lightning, where Benjamin Franklin and Vergennes finally had the victory they needed to formalize their alliance. France would openly enter the war, transforming what had been a colonial rebellion into a worldwide conflict that Britain could never hope to win alone. The real tragedy for Britain wasn't just the loss of 5,000 soldiers, but the complete exposure of its strategic incompetence. Two major armies operating within a few hundred miles of each other had never coordinated their movements, never supported each other's objectives, and never even maintained meaningful communication. It was a failure of leadership that would echo through military academies for centuries to come. For America, Saratoga proved that its cause was more than just a desperate gamble. European volunteers like Kosciuszko and Lafayette had shown that the principles of liberty resonated far beyond colonial shores. The victory demonstrated that with determination, clever strategy, and a little help from their enemies' mistakes, even the world's greatest empire could be defeated. The tide had truly turned, and there would be no going back.